everybody, welcome back. This week I wanted to take an opportunity to highlight a table that I just recently got done building. And if you follow me on Instagram, you've probably seen a lot of the progress. So the first thing that I did is I cut all of my boards to the rough length that I wanted my tabletop to be in the end. From there I took them over to the joiner so I could joint one edge of each board before taking them over to the table saw. Once I got them over to the table saw, I cut each one of the boards down to whatever the desired width of that board was going to be. And on this tabletop and on many of the tabletops that I build, each board is not the same width. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, it tends to break up the monotony of exactly the same size boards, as well as it really just depends on what's available at my local lumber supplier. So once I've cut all my pieces to the proper width, I take them over to my assembly table. And what I'm doing here is I'm just lining up the boards based off how wide they are and really just trying to get a good feel on whether or not all the seams are going to be nice and tight. And as I put all the boards together, I take a look at it, and if I notice one like here that the seams could be better, I just flip it around. Then once I have my tabletop laid out the way that I want it, I just take a straight edge, and here I'm just marking all of the spots where I'm going to use my biscuits. And for this project, I decided to use biscuits for this tabletop. So I just make sure that everything's in line, quick reference. And once I've marked all my lines, then I get out my biscuit joiner and go down the line with each board until I have all of my biscuits complete. Then once I've done all my biscuits, it's time to go ahead and start gluing and adding all the biscuits to the slots. And for this, I do just like most people do, and I initially go down and put glue in each one of the slots, and then I go down each one of the individual boards and place glue along the entire seams. Then I'll go back and I'll start putting in all of my biscuits. And here I went ahead and started to assemble my tabletop, and I usually just do this one board at a time and just go down the list. I don't care about getting them super close together. Initially, I just want to make sure all the biscuits line up to where when I start clamping it, like I am here, everything will line up relatively good. And in this case, I start on one end, go to the other end, and then start working my way towards the middle. As I'm clamping it up, I really only just try to clamp it till it has enough pressure till I see the glue start to squeeze out. And then what I do is once the glue starts to dry, I'll go back over the top of it with a scraper like this, or even a card scraper works very well also. But either way, I just want to get the majority of the glue off the top just so it'll save me a lot of time when it comes to sanding. After the tabletop has had the opportunity to dry, I just take off all the clamps, and in this case, I just had to put it off to the side because I knew I wasn't going to touch it again until it was time to start sanding. So now it's out of the way. Next thing that I wanted to start working on was the frame for not only the bench, but the table as well. And this table is constructed of laminated 8-quarter red oak. And the base is essentially a 4x4. So I had to laminate each one of the pieces so I could get 4x4s, since finding oak 4x4s is pretty much impossible. So after laminating all the pieces, I put them in clamps, and now that they're dry, I'm removing them from the clamps so I can take them to the joiner and planer and get them to the final dimensions that I want for this project. So for this table, instead of them being 4 inches by 4 inches, I wanted to get them down to 3.25 by 3.25, so 3 1/4. And so what I did is on each one of these pieces, I jointed 2 different edges or sides, so I would have 2 different reference points when I put them through the planer. So once I had 2 flat sides, I made sure I referenced which sides those were so I could use those when I put them through the planer each time. And then I just went down until each side had been planed down and the total final dimensions was 3 1/4. And unlike on most things, I always leave my pieces longer, so it gives me the opportunity, like here, to cut down to the final length at the end. After they were cut to length, I needed to round over the edge on both ends of each one of these long stretchers for the table. So I cut those corners roughly on the bandsaw, and from the bandsaw I took them over to my spindle sander where I smoothed everything out to make sure that each one was the same. And I just used a reference line that I traced on each one of the boards individually. Now that I have all my pieces cut for the frame of the table, what I'm doing here is I'm lining up all the pieces that will go together for each one of the X frames on the ends of the table. And the thing that I wanted to do was focus on what the center line for everything was going to be. And by marking the center line on each one of these boards, it allows for really easy, fast alignment when it comes time to assemble everything. So once I have measured it on one of the boards, I'll simply just scribe that on all of the boards. So the first thing that I started to assemble is the center beam and then the bracket that's going to go on the bottom. And for this, as you can see, I used glue and pin nails just to hold it in place while it was drying. I decided to do the frame for the benches at the same time. And so the bench is the same design, just on a smaller scale. And so for this, because I don't have that piece in between, I decided just to use dominoes to assemble each one of the bench frames. Plus it gives it a little bit more strength. Now that I'd finished up the vertical braces for not only the table but the bench as well, I went ahead and started to build the horizontal brace, which these braces I previously made will be attached to. And to do that, again, I use dominoes. And because I don't have any clamps long enough to clamp a piece this long down, I like to use cargo straps. While those pieces are drying and clamped up, what I wanted to do is go ahead and get back to the tabletop. So this tabletop came out really smooth for the most part, but what I'm doing here is I'm just using my card scraper to level out any places where the seams may be higher than one another. And then also if I have any remaining glue, this is my opportunity to get it off. And once I finish that up, I figured since I have the tabletop out, I'll go ahead and cut it to its final length. And the first step that I take is I'll use my track saw and I'll just cut off a very small amount on one end, because I typically will leave about an inch of length so I can cut it later on. So once I've cut one end and it's square, I then measure the total length. I take my track saw and will cut off the remaining portion, giving me the final length that I wanted for this tabletop. So once I finished up working outside for a little bit, I decided to go back inside and start assembling the base for the bench. And the joinery method that I used primarily on this table is the Festool domino. Now, when you see me using the Festool domino, it is not the only method that can be used. It's just the method that I'm using and that I like a lot and works really well for this application. So once I have placed the brace on one end, it's too tall for my table, so I went ahead and put it on the ground so I can go ahead and attach the other end. So after I assembled the bench base, I decided to move back to the table base while the other piece is drying. And so what I'm doing here is I'm drilling my dominoes, which I will also drill into each one of the X frames that will go on each end, and using the center line as my reference point on each one. So now that I've cut all my dominoes, I went ahead and started gluing all the surfaces that would be joining each other. This right here will be attached to the bottom rail, and then there will be a top rail that will go on it as well. So here I just put it in place, make sure everything lines up, and use my pin nailer to pin it in place while the glue dries. I then repeated the same exact step on the other end, as you see here. So since I milled all my lumber and everything is nice and flat, I wasn't too concerned with applying any sort of clamping pressure at this point, mainly due to the fact that once I get all this glue spread, I'm going to be placing another beam that's pretty substantial in weight that's going to sit on top of it and apply an ample amount of pressure. So by applying the glue and just using the pin nails, it seemed to be just about right, and I was still getting glue squeeze out. So now that I've glued all this up, I'm now taking the top stretcher and I'm just going to place it right on top, make sure everything's lined up. And at this point, I went ahead and clamped the top pieces because it does not have any of the additional weight provided like the bottom piece did. Now that the frames themselves are pretty much built, the next thing I moved on to was figuring out all the cross members that would go basically as decoration. And to do that, I took some MDF scraps that I had lying around and cut them to the same width and started trying to determine some angles that I would need, and I took them over to the miter saw and cut those angles and then test fit. And here I realized I think that the pieces need to actually be a little bit more vertical just due to the space not being as much as it is on the table, and I think it was a right choice. And so once I did that, I went ahead and took it over to the table saw, cut my strips, used my templates to trace onto each piece, and then took it back over to the miter saw so I could cut them to their final dimensions. Once I had done that, I took them back over to the frame and started to attach. And again, to do this, I simply used glue and pin nails to hold it in place while it dries, as these are really not providing any sort of structural support to this project. But the glue itself is more than strong enough to hold in this application. I followed pretty much the exact same procedure for the X's on each one of the ends of not only the bench but the table as well. Again, just using glue and pin nails to hold it in place. And then following the exact same procedures on the table frame itself. Because I had a much wider space to work with, I did decide to use one corner to approximately the center of the bottom of the table, just to give it a little bit more of a appealing look as opposed to more straight up and down like I had to do with the benches. But again, the benches were just meant to match the same style as the table itself. So once all the main assembly was done, the only thing I had left to do was to stain and apply polyurethane. The stain that I used for the bench and the tabletop was Minwax Dark Walnut, and it came out really, really nice. And the way that I applied the stain to this tabletop was to wipe it on, which is a technique that I hadn't used previously in the past, but with a large flat project like this, it worked out great. Once all the stain was applied, then I just went back over it with some of these shop towels until I get all the additional stain off of the table, and to make sure it was a nice, smooth, even coat of stain all over the tabletop. After doing the tabletop, I moved on to the base of the bench and the table itself, and it's a different color for the bases. And in this, it was a gel stain from General Finishes called Java, and the client just wanted a two-tone finish. So my application for this was also to wipe it on, and it worked out really well. I was a little worried about using the gel stain as a wipe on, but it was extremely easy and very, very quick compared to other techniques that I've done in the past, because it required a lot less cleanup afterwards. Once the stain was dry, I finished it off with a water-based polyurethane that I sprayed, and the finish came out satin, and the end result is exactly what I wanted. Here are some finished shots of the final product. And as always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. If you're not already subscribed to me on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. If you like this video or think somebody else would like it, make sure you hit like and share. And if you're not following me on Instagram, go check me out there at Bent's Woodworking, and you'll get to see what I'm doing on a daily basis. And if you ever have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me a DM or leave the comments down below, and I promise I'll get back to you. So that's all I have for you this week. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to next week.